We all moved our 6 cars to China, to Beijing, drove down to Shanghai to the MG factory, had a look around the factory, and then drove through China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, Turkey, and on through Europe. Fantastic drive, brilliant driving. So 2 years later, we shipped the cars to Cape Town, and we drove through South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Tanzania. We would have traveled around the world, both this way around and that way around.
MGB production started in 1962. The first one, I believe, was Iris Blue, a pretty car that went out to California, and it's still around. Very nice MGB. It replaced the MGA, also a nice car. The MGA still had a full chassis. Had the pretty rounded lines. There was the 1500, then the 1600, and then the Mark II with the 1622 engine in the MGAs. The MGB came out with the 1800, three main bearing crank at first, and then that was upgraded to a 5 main bearing crank a little bit later. Very, very nice car. It was a monocoque construction. Had a separate subframe for the front suspension, which was still like an MGA front suspension, but it was not a full chassis like the MGA was. Still had a live rear axle, kind of crude and basic, but effective. The car handled it well, and it was fairly inexpensive for the day. Nice leather interior, good-looking car, nice colors, wire wheels an option, overdrive an option. And an MGB is just a nice, nice everyday sports car. It was, like I say, 4-cylinder, twin carbs, 1800 cc's. Just a nice, nice little cast iron engine.
In our MGB register, we have MGBs, which were manufactured in England from 1962 until 1980. They include the chrome bumper cars, which also have chrome grills. And then in 1974, 74 and a half, due to emission standards and safety standards here in the United States, the cars were actually raised by 2 inches, and their chrome bumpers were changed to rubber bumpers. So the side of the car, the basic shell of the car is similar, but the bumpers changed and the configuration changed a little bit. As I said, cars were manufactured until 1980. In the MGB model range, there were 512,000 cars manufactured. At the time, it was the largest selling model of sports car in the world. That has now been eclipsed by the Mazda Miata. And recently, the Mazda Miata group, with all their different variations, has just gone over 1 million cars. The MGBs were the second MG produced that was a monocoque, or the body had no frame underneath it. The first car to do that was the MG Midget. And the MG Midget was actually an Austin Healey Sprite. The Austin Healey Sprite production was moved to Abingdon, and in Abingdon they started producing the MG Midget. The MG Midget was produced there up until late, I think, 1979. They also went through the chrome bumper stage up until 1974, and then in 75 through 1979 they went through the rubber bumper stage. The first MG Midgets had Austin engines in them, 948, I think 1098, and then 1275 engines. They evolved from drum brakes to disc brakes in the front. In 1975, when they went to the rubber bumper cars, the Midgets evolved into a Triumph Spitfire engine, and they had that 1500 size engine from 75 to 79. As far as engines in the MGB started off with roughly 98 horsepower. And it was in an 1800 cc engine, 1.8 liters. That engine size remained the same for the entire production run of the MGBs. However, due to emission standards in the United States and the world becoming more restrictive, the number of horsepower, by the time they became rubber bumper cars, they went from 2 SU carburetors to 1 Stromberg carburetor. The net British horsepower dropped from around 98 down to around 75, maybe even a little bit less than that. So we also needed to add a catalytic converter. The catalytic converter was right in the engine, right where the exhaust manifold is. So you have a very hot catalytic converter and an exhaust manifold. This makes the front of those cars even warmer, and it also had an impact on fuel economy and the amount of horsepower that you had. So many of our cars today, if they still have catalytic converters, have moved the catalytic converter out of the engine compartment and placed it underneath the car back towards the muffler, so that you still have a catalytic converter, but the airflow is better.
This one we're looking at here is a 1974, and as you can see, it's the GT, which is the coupe version of the MGB. It's got the hard top going all the way back. It has a hatch in the rear that opens up. Spare tire storage, jack, extra parts. And it's a very nice touring car, especially with the V8.
In point of fact, the car that I've got, the MGB GT, that is the car that I had my sights on, for years. And I tried to steer design in that direction. What had inspired it, I don't know what year it was, perhaps 53, 4, something like that. The DB24 Aston Martin, 3 of them had run as a team at Silverstone in a production car race. And they'd fascinated me running 1, 2, 3. I said, that's the shape, that's what we want to do. So let's try and build the poor man's Aston Martin. We had to build then the TD and the TF and the Y-type. No, we were already building the Y-type at that time, but certainly the TD and the TF, and then the MGA before we got around to the MGB. And then 4 years after that, the one with the top off. See? But so I must say that the MGB GT was my favorite car.
The MGB GT, which went to rubber bumpers as well in 1974 and a half, continued in production in England, but it was no longer brought to the United States after late 1974 or early 1975. In the MGB series, we also have the MGC. The MGC was produced in Abingdon from beginning in July of 1967 until 1969. The MGB shell is the basic shell. However, there was a number of significant changes besides increasing from a 4-cylinder, 1.8 cylinder engine to a 6-cylinder, roughly 3-liter engine. The net increase in weight in the front went up about, 200 pounds, I believe. It may have been more than that. But in order to accommodate that, they needed to change the suspension in the front of the C. They also needed to run torsion bars to underneath the front seats. So although the front seats look very similar in construction to that of an MGB, they actually raised the floor about 1.5 inches, 1 3/4 inches, cut down the base of the seat to a shortly lower squab that you sit on. And this helped the car perform better, steer better. They also increased the brakes in the MGC, the braking strength. The MGB is a great touring car and a great cornering car. The MGC is really a Gran Turismo. So when you talk about an MGB being a roadster, in '65 they went to an MGB GT, which was a Gran Turismo. But by adding the MGC, the 6-cylinder engine, they really made, when they made a Gran Turismo, that was a great touring car, because you can get on an MGC and effortlessly cruise 70, 75, 80 miles an hour with that 6-cylinder car up and down hills, but you can't corner quite as well as you can in an MGB. The MGC was actually going to be, or thought of as, the continuation of the Austin Healey. The Austin Healey ceased manufacturing in 1967 or early '68, so this was the continuation car.
All of the uniqueness of an MGC was based off of the 3-liter motor. It's a C, what's considered a C-series motor, and it was used in an Austin Healey, but for this particular car, it's a modified C-series of the motor. In this series motor, when it was redesigned, they went to 7 bearings, and it resulted in, it's about a 200-pound lighter motor than the Austin Healey C-series motor, and it ended up about 2 inches shorter from front to back. However, with those modifications, it still didn't fit in the MGB engine bay. So they had to start modifying the MGBs so that everything would fit. And what they first modified was the suspension to get the engine lower, and then secondly they had to modify the front with the radiator, moving it forward. With those modifications, it has a totally different suspension than the MGB. It has what's called a torsion bar suspension. And with the torsion bar suspension, it has torsion bars that run from approximately the front axle all the way back to underneath the seat. The next problem they ran into was the seats from an MGB wouldn't fit because they had to raise the floors for the torsion bars to fit right. So the next modification was the seat heights. So the way they handled that was basically they cut about 1.5 inches out of the frames and lowered the seats. They got the engine in there, and then they found out, well, it still didn't fit. So the next modifications were with the hood. Visually, MGB versus the MGC, that's about the only exterior modification that you're going to notice. This front bump is from the radiator because it's moved so far forward and it didn't fit, so they made the front bump. Then they found, well, the carburetors didn't fit. So that's why the second bump was in there.
We also then had another derivation, which Ken Costello realized that you could put an MG into an MGB engine compartment, a V8. And these were the V8s that General Motors had produced in the United States, but then sold the licensing rights to British Leyland. So these were V8s with all aluminum blocks that were in Pontiacs and Buicks. It was a Buick Skylark, a Pontiac Tempest, and it may also have been an Oldsmobile. I can't remember the model of the car. But these small V8s actually weigh, I believe, 40 to 80 pounds less than a 4-cylinder, 1.8-liter engine that's in a normal MGB. The V8s, not only weighing less, which made the balance of the car even better, also have a great deal more horsepower. So after Ken Costello did this, the MG factory thought, well, if Ken can do it, we can do it. So they went into buying an engine from Rover, which was producing the engine in England, dropped them into MGBs. They sold those cars, but they thought with the emission standards that were happening in the United States about this time, that they may not pass emission standards in the United States. So therefore, they were sold in England and in Europe.
The V8 is a 3.5-liter all aluminum engine, It has Buick origins here in the U.S. It was a, I think a 210 or 216, something like that it was called, back in the 60s. And Rover bought it, and it was a 3.5 liter designation in the UK. Made a very, very nice engine for this car and many other cars in England. Ken Costello was the originator of putting aluminum engines in MGBs, and after he made a small number of them, then British Leyland kind of got on the stick and started building some on their own. It was a low-cost project, as most things were with British Leyland in that day. But the engine was only, well, it was 40 pounds lighter than the standard MGB four-cylinder engine, and another 50% in horsepower. And it made a very, very nice quick engine, quick car. The gearbox was standard with overdrive. It had special alloy wheels and the V8 badges and uprated brakes, and it even had a brake booster, and it had twin electric fans. Like most MGs, this one also has twin carbs. And one of the things interesting about the factory V8s, there was no bubble on the top bonnet panel. So in order to accomplish that, they designed the special manifold so they could mount the SU carburetors further back rather than right here in the middle, which would have necessitated a bubble in the sheet metal above it. Basically, it's a standard aluminum block, standard aluminum heads. There's nothing particularly racy. It's just a nice size engine and very nice performance. And those were about the main differences from the other MGs of the era. The V8 was only available in this coupe version. It was not available in a Roadster, although one was made, and Don Hayter owns that car in England. There were 2,500, roughly 2,500 V8s made over the course of about 3 or 4 years. It was during the chrome bumper to rubber bumper conversion, and I think about half of them were chrome bumper and probably half of them were rubber bumper. This one, being a 1974, is chrome bumper, and it's in the original Blaze paint with black interior.
In fact, one of the rare cars that we have is an MGB GT V8, which is a left-hand drive. It was a prototype that was actually made in England and brought to the United States to be test driven over here to see if the United States would like to have this car. Unfortunately, at the same time, there were other British Leyland marques that also had gone from 6 cylinders to 12 cylinders. And so the V8 was such a popular car and had so much horsepower, but it may have been competing with a Jaguar or other types of cars whose engine displacement was expanded at the same time. So the cars were not marketed in the United States, only in Britain and in Europe. We had several Jubilee models produced here in the United States for our production. They also had a Jubilee model produced in England. Little did we know that the MGB would continue in production until 1980, but we're very pleased that they did.